From the Roman Empire to Chinese dynasties, the world has seen the dominance of power shift time and time again. Today, the United States of America is the most powerful country in the world. Through its immense economy and devastating military, it commands global supremacy that no other nation can currently rival. But power, however, is only an illusion. And when it comes down to the United States of America, this illusion of power is starting to wear thin. The British Empire once stood as the mightiest force on the planet, but it imploded in spectacular fashion. And with this polarization gripping America's political system, the country appears to be on a path to a very similar fate of the United Kingdom. I want to explore the factors that contributed to the rise and fall of the British Empire. I want to analyze whether these similarities in the current geopolitical landscape can lead to a very similar outcome to the United States. So join me today as I delve into the history of empires and consider what lessons we can learn about what the future has in store for the United States. My name is Pete, and I'm holding a banana. Chapter 1: The Rise. This idea of an extensive empire and maintaining global supremacy is not a modern creation. The most burning example dates back to the Roman Empire, which spanned from Britannia to the Persian Gulf at its height. But it wasn't just the Western world with massive empires, because China, pretty much at the same time, held domination over much of Asia. These periods of dominant peace throughout the Roman and Chinese empires are referred to as Pax Romana and Pax Sinica. And we can use the same system and naming to the British and American period. So we're going to call it Pax Britannia and Pax Americana. Now, Pax Britannia spanned from 1815 to the start of the First World War in 1914, while Pax Americana ranges from the end of the Second World War in 1945 to pretty much today. Now, what's really fascinating is understanding how these nations actually got dominance in the first place and why the British Empire declined, and it could actually spell what the future has in store for the United States. The very first thing we do when analyzing a superpower's status tends to be looking at its geographical location. Both the United States and the UK itself have one similar great strength, and it's not this very sexy English language. Neither nation borders with a major political rival, and they haven't done so throughout their history. While France and Germany had to vie for control of the whole of European mainland, the British Channel kept the United Kingdom away from the bulk of all the physical fighting. Similarly, the United States has a great size and a dominance on the North American continent, meaning it had few territorial disputes during its entire existence. And these two empires grew their dominance through expansion in the rest of the world. While the United Kingdom focused its efforts on establishing colonies in India, West Africa, and Australia, the United States secured control over territories in the Pacific and South America. So strong was America's belief that the future world would be guaranteed by overseas territories, it enforced a Monroe Doctrine, which simply means that no interference by European superpowers would be tolerated in the Western Hemisphere. With colonies all over the globe, these two empires established a tight control over a wider range of land than they were currently governing, giving them significant influence beyond their actual borders. Finally, we have to talk about sea power and the foreign military bases, which played a huge role in development of both of these empires during their dominant periods. The British Empire literally ruled the waves, as the song dictates. They secured a tight hold over the world's shipping lanes, which they used to grow their economy and gain control over the global market. Thanks to these ample naval bases, they established massive colonies. Brits realized very early on that ships eventually needed maintenance and repair, so they established bases around the world so that a British vessel sailing in the Caribbean could stop for supplies and a banana like this one in the West Indies, while another ship at the same time patrolling the West African coast could just pop into a port in Nigeria to repair itself. No other power at the time could boast anywhere close to the same naval control that the British Empire had. And the funny thing is, the United States followed a very similar path. By developing themselves a powerful naval force and establishing military bases literally across the world, the US was able to establish a firm control in multiple regions all at once. You can fly anywhere in the world: Japan, Australia, Yemen, Spain, Taiwan, and you will find an American military presence in some form in one of these countries you visited. Most importantly, the United States was the first country to also develop the nuclear bomb, giving it a massive destructional power and advantage over the world for a short period of time. So the United States and the UK both followed similar models to establish their periods of dominance. But while the United States sat at the top of this international political food chain, the British Empire has basically crumbled into dust. And whether one welcomes this idea or not, there are striking similarities between the decline of the British Empire and what is currently happening in the United States. These parallels suggest that the end of American dominance may just be over the horizon.
Chapter 2: The Fall.
In the years before the outbreak of World War II, the United Kingdom faced a host of challenges. The end of Great Britain's dominance was literally written on the walls, and anyone with any form of hindsight could basically see it. From economic decline to rising tensions in other countries, the British Empire was in a precarious position, leading up to one of the deadliest and notably one of the most expensive conflicts in human history. The Great Depression had a devastating effect on much of the world, and the UK, being the superpower at the time, was definitely no exception. The British economy shrank dramatically during this period of unemployment, and people were literally struggling to feed themselves. The government attempted to implement various measures to stimulate growth, and these efforts were basically largely unsuccessful. The economical turmoil left the empire vulnerable. Overseas territories like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand obtained self-sustaining governance through the 1931 Statute of Westminster. The 1930s also saw a rise in political instability in Britain as multiple governments rose and fell in just a few short years. During this time, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain showed some appeasement to policies which were happening over in Nazi Germany, and as you can imagine, it caused a lot of controversy both at home in the British mainland and in all of the other bodies it was operating in. After Germany occupied Rhineland in 1936, the British Prime Minister was simply too lenient to Hitler. He was hoping to avoid a future conflict, which we now know was World War II. Many believed that Chamberlain at the time should have taken a much bigger hardline stance against Hitler's aggression. Instead of trying to appease Hitler, he tried to appease him through diplomatic means. Perhaps the most devastating of all was that the UK's enormous public debt before the Second World War was absolutely alarming. The First World War put a massive strain on the British economy, leading the country into having to take out loans from the United States. In 1914, the UK's public debt stood at more than 30% of its GDP. In 1934, the UK owed to the United States alone a staggering 225 billion British pounds. And that figure, for clarity, is converted into today's money. This was just another nail in the coffin of the British Empire. But it didn't end there. After Germany's defeat in World War II, the UK public debt spiraled out of control. Like I said, it used to be 30% pre-war. It then went to an unimaginable 200% of Britain's total GDP. The British Empire's fate at this point is completely sealed. The immense cost of not one but two world wars, both in money and manpower, opened the door to the British colonies to seek independence. And effectively, this is the end to Pax Britannica. So what about the United States? Well, there's very similar patterns happening right now in the American economy. We know that the United States debt is piling up, and their grasp on real-world politics is as shaky as Joe Biden on a staircase. So does this mean it's the end of the American empire? Well, yes, and also no. Simply put, the world is a very different beast to what it was in the 20th century. Technology is developing at break record speeds and only increasing upwards. The internet has made everybody have an opinion and be more connected than ever. So a direct one-on-one comparison between the two Pax Americana and Pax Britannica would be pretty hard to do. However, they say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Or if you ask economist Nick Colas, he would say it raps. There are some very distinct similarities between the end of the British Empire and modern-day Americana. The UK saw its government become increasingly divided during the 1920s due to major disagreements between the Labour and Conservative parties over simple fiscal policies. This divide caused widespread protests throughout the whole nation, and citizens ultimately lost faith in their leaders. Today in the US, we are seeing very similar issues in the government. Both left and right have become more partisan than they ever were before. You are either right or wrong. There's no grey area. Both both sides of politicians have to take a straight line in the sand. They rarely come together on any decision. Simple decisions like healthcare reform and immigration reform, surely there should be a crossover. But it seems there isn't. Some might point to the financial crisis of 2008 or even the global recession caused by the whole lockdowns and indicate this is a signal of the US's impending collapse. But I want to stress, these economical impacts, although they were hard, they were nothing in comparison to the Great Depression or any of the two world wars. These three crashes are just in a different league of their own. However, there are still some very worrying trends that the current global and economical system is not out of the woods just yet, and the American empire is still teetering a tightrope. As I mentioned earlier, the real death blow to the British Empire and the end of the Pax Britannicana as a whole was the mountain of piles of public debt that had occurred during the 20th century. And when an aggressive foreign nation comes to shake things up and test the balance of power, the cost of fighting simply tore the British Empire down. And when we look at the US's current economical situation, it's very similar. Even though the 225 billion of British debt at its highs is still nothing in comparison to the current 31 trillion US dollars the Americans are currently indebted to. The UK never fully recovered from its debt crisis after 1945, and the country's financial power in terms of GDP continued to wane it down to the 6th largest economy in the world, and I dare say it will continue falling. The worst thing about the US's debt, this 31 trillion, is 1 trillion US dollars of it is owed to their biggest rival, China. When Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, the European powers immediately saw the threat he posed to the stability of control of the continent. Hitler saw the economical weakness of the great former colonialist nations and sought to expose this weakness for his own nation's benefit. Now, China finds itself in a similar situation. While the US struggles to tame inflation, has problems with interest rates and poverty, let alone its massive debt pile. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, no rival empire came to take its place. The end of Pax Romana and Seneca did not usher Pax Celtica or Japonica. When the British Empire faded, however, the United States quickly took the reins of power and established itself as the global policeman, creating institutions such as the United Nations. Now that the United States' hold on the power is fumbling, China could indeed step up and do exactly what the United States did to the United Kingdom. As China invests more and more into Africa, a similar strategy that the United States has done to grab power in its early years, China seeks to rival the United States in their international influence. Although it still has a long way to go, it's clear that China will one day overtake the United States economy. It's difficult to say in a modern world how many of these factors can actually indicate to the end of the Pax Americana. The United strength on the world is definitely dwindling, but it still does remain the most powerful nation on Earth. So no one can really say for sure whether the America's reign on the world will continue long into the future, or it will be soon swallowed up by the sands of time, like many other empires in its wake. And yet we can't help but draw the parallels between both the end of the British Empire and modern day America. I'm not going to eat this in front of you, you perverts.